Hello and welcome to Unacademy IAS English, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good evening and welcome to NCERT Fundamentals. So today would be the second episode for Political Science and International Relations under the NCERT Fundamentals course that we have launched. So today I'll be taking up a very important topic from the Class 12 textbook that is related to politics in India since independence. I'll be taking up the chapter on India's external relations and particularly will cover India's relations that began with China starting from 1949. We'll understand the background to India-China relations today based on the content provided in the NCERT textbook. This discussion would be very helpful for your mains and as well as your prelims examination. In the end, I'll discuss a practice question as well. But before we start, we have a very important announcement. As you saw in the trailer that played at the start of the video, Unacademy UPSC Summit is going to be held on the 20th and 21st of July. This is a mega event which will bring eminent personalities from various fields, and these eminent personalities will be taking up thought-provoking classes on public administration, diplomacy, sports, and other key areas which will help IAS aspirants as part of the journey with regard to their IAS preparation. We have the likes of Union Minister Nitin Gadkari to Jairam Ramesh, Suhasini Haidar, VVS Lakshman, and many more. So these initiatives would help you gain some insight into the practical challenges faced in administration. You'll get to listen from the practitioners regarding the real-world challenges that India is facing as far as administration is concerned. You'll get to listen to analysts and even athletes who can inspire and motivate you and provide the strategy to handle stress and even develop the mental stamina required to crack India's elite exam, which is the civil services exam. So do enroll for the summit by using the link provided in the description and attend these sessions without fail. With this, let's start our discussion. We'll be discussing this Class 12 textbook, Politics in India Since Independence, and I'll be taking up the chapter on India's external relations. If you guys remember, if you have watched the first session for PSIR, I already covered one part of this chapter. In the previous class, we had discussed Nehru's foundational principles, which laid the origin of India's foreign policy, and how Nehru championed the foundational principles of India's external relations. We understood the principle of non-alignment, the principle of strategic autonomy, etc. So today I'll be continuing this discussion and we'll specifically look at the evolution of India's relations with our neighboring country, China. In the next class, we'll be discussing the evolution of India's ties with Pakistan as well. That's why I told you that this chapter in the Class 12 NCERT book is actually very important for international relations in GS Paper 2 and as well as for your PSIR optional. So today's focus is on peace and conflict with China. How India's relations began with China in 1949, how it evolved, how tensions developed, and how eventually it led to a war in 1962. With regard to India-China relations, there is a lot of criticism against then Prime Minister Nehru. It's been alleged by the critics that Prime Minister Nehru mishandled this relationship. So let's carry out a detailed analysis of this important and sensitive topic in the next 30 to 40 minutes. See, China was established in 1949. That is, I'm referring to PRC, People's Republic of China. The authoritarian communist state was established in 1949 as an independent sovereign nation. This was following the Chinese Civil War that we witnessed from 1930s to 1940s. The then Republic of China, which ruled over mainland China, was thrown out of power by the Maoist movement led by Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong would instigate the peasants, the farmers, and the weaker classes who apparently felt discriminated under the rule of the Republic of China. They were organized into a mass armed rebellion by Mao Zedong based on his left-wing extremist ideology. based on left-wing extremist communism, Mao Zedong would inspire a revolution, an armed revolution, leading to a civil war in the country, and eventually the Republic of China would be thrown out of power. The ROC and the Kuomintang party would be cornered into the small island of Taiwan, and the Communist Party of China under Mao Zedong would rise to power in mainland China, and they successfully captured state power. So following this violent revolution, the communists came to power and the PRC was established. So when the PRC was established in 1949, by then India had already become independent from colonial rule. So India welcomed the establishment of PRC, and initially India empathized with the Chinese state and the Chinese people. Because in many ways, the struggle of Indian people and the Chinese people was similar. If you look at medieval times and even modern history, most Asian countries, they have suffered from outside exploitation, especially the exploitation from colonial powers. Just like India was exploited by European powers, particularly the British, China would also face severe outside exploitation from the British, the French, and especially from Imperial Japan. Imperial fascist Japan had committed brutal atrocities against China, which had hurt the pride and ego of the Chinese people. So, when Mao Zedong gave a call for the masses to unite and rebel against the Republic of China, it was only natural for the people of China to unite and fight this armed rebellion, to get involved in this armed rebellion, to not just seek independence for the country, but also to ensure that they would restore the lost glory of the Chinese Empire. So in many ways, if you look at the establishment of PRC, it was rooted in a violent ideology, a radical extremist ideology. Left-wing extremism that was championed by Mao Zedong would eventually inspire Maoist rebellions around the world, including in India, which we call as Naxalism. So this ideology was inherently violent, and which possibly explains the aggression that you see in PRC even today. If you look at how PRC reacts with other countries, how PRC deals with the territorial boundary issues with its neighbors, and how the PRC expanded its territorial control and occupied and annexed new territories after 1949, that expansive aggression, that territorial expansionism, is possibly explained by the violent radical ideology which led to the foundation, the establishment of the PRC. So there were many warning signs for India. It was very clear that China would be an authoritarian state. Under the Communist Party, inspired by Mao ideology, inspired by a left-wing extremist ideology, it was very clear that China might become an aggressive power, an expansionist power. But Prime Minister Nehru, being a statesman, chose to set aside the concerns and out of goodwill decided to establish friendly relations with China. And China reciprocated as well. Believe it or not, initially, India-China did establish friendly relations with each other. India recognized the establishment of PRC. In fact, India was one of the first countries in the world to give recognition to the new Chinese government. India would even support the PRC's membership at the United Nations and eventually its permanent membership at the UN Security Council. And in return, India was expecting friendly relations from China, and China reciprocated as well. For at least a few months, from 1949 to 1950, friendly relations did begin between India and China. But however, PRC would immediately take up certain decisions. It would commit certain actions which would be a violation of international law, which would also create volatility and instability in the region, posing a concern, a direct threat for India and other countries in the region. The PRC started displaying its expansionist tendencies. It would annex Inner Mongolia, it would annex the Xinjiang region, and finally in 1950, it annexed Tibet as well. Tibet until then was an independent Himalayan kingdom, which had been cultivated as a buffer state by the British. Right? The British Indian government had an agreement with the Kingdom of Tibet, and Tibet had been granted its autonomy. It was an independent kingdom at that point. So when PRC expanded its territory by occupying these territories from Inner Mongolia in the northeast region to the Xinjiang province in the west to Tibet in the south-southeast region. Very quickly, China expanded its territory, and overnight it became a neighbor of India and other small Himalayan kingdoms. It would share borders with Nepal, Bhutan and Sikkim, and of course with India as well. So this aggressive expansion of China, it raised an alarm around the world, and even India was worried, India was concerned. Small countries like Nepal and Bhutan and even Sikkim, which was a protectorate state of India, they were all equally concerned about the rising Chinese aggression and its expansionist tendencies. So on one hand, India became cautious. We entered into security agreements with Nepal, Bhutan and Sikkim. India would play a defining role in enhancing the defense capabilities of Nepal, Bhutan and Sikkim. We would even jointly patrol the borders of these countries with China. We would supply arms and weapons and get involved in defense and military training of the armed forces of these Himalayan countries. Parallelly, Prime Minister Nehru still believed that China had a good heart. Nehru still believed that China would never harm its relations with India. But however, things started turning sour very soon. Things started going down very soon, because when China annexed Tibet, it led to large-scale human rights violations. The Tibetan Buddhists, they would resist the Chinese annexation, and India would condemn this annexation. By that time, the Western powers led by United States, they had already condemned the Chinese annexation of Tibet, and US had even cut off its relations with China. So please remember that this was the time of the Cold War rivalries between capitalist democracies of the West and the communist authoritarian powers of the East had just begun after the Second World War. So China, which was an authoritarian communist state, saw India as a democratic ally of the Western powers. So when India criticized the annexation of Tibet and expressed concern about the Tibetans, China did not like the statements made by India, especially by Prime Minister Nehru. So Mao Zedong would express concern about India's statements and would label this as India's interference in the internal matters of China. China claimed that Tibet was its internal territory. It was an internal issue. And any statement from India or any move by India to support the Tibetan cause or even to express concern about the situation in Tibet would be met with an aggressive reaction from China. So this is where the misunderstandings began between the two countries. Now, these misunderstandings very quickly turned into a border issue as well, especially in the Ladakh region over Aksai Chin. By 1954, India-China had developed a different perception of the boundary line, because India had inherited the British era boundaries, and we presumed that these would be the international borders as well, because back then this boundary was supposed to be between India and Tibet. But now that China had annexed Tibet, China refused to acknowledge these British era boundaries, and it started creating trouble for India in the border areas. India discovered that China was constructing a road in Aksai Chin, which was passing through Indian territory. So when India opposed this road construction activity, right, and India even published official maps in 1954 showing all these territories in Aksai Chin as part of Indian territory. So this would be the first major border misunderstanding that emerged. And I'll explain why China got so interested in Aksai Chin. Why would it take up the construction of a road in Aksai Chin, even though it knew that it would create troubles with India? I will come to that point. But before we discuss the relevance of Aksai Chin for China, I would like to explain how Prime Minister Nehru reached out to China despite all these problems and misunderstandings, and how Nehru tried to rebuild the relationship. Nehru would work with Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, and both the leaders would pay a historic visit to each other's countries. Nehru visited China and Zhou Enlai came to India. This was a landmark visit. Both countries were trying to rectify the friction, the damage that had already developed, and they were trying to make a new start in the relationship. This led to the establishment of the Panchsheel principles between India and China, also called the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. These principles were inspired by the principles of Buddhism, where a Buddhist monk is expected to abide by 5 principles, which essentially states that you should not interfere in others' internal issues. You should not threaten others. You should maintain peaceful coexistence with others. These are few virtues or principles that Buddhism advocates for a Buddhist monk. Since Buddhism was a common binding factor between India and China, the two countries drew inspiration from these Buddhist principles and they brought out the Panchsheel, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. They both committed to address the tensions and the friction and the misunderstanding, and they agreed to begin a new relationship, to start a new era, to reset the relationship. They promised to each other to peacefully coexist, which means both the countries would not threaten each other. They would commit towards mutual non-aggression. That is, even if there are issues and disputes, we will never get aggressive, we'll never get into a physical confrontation. So the entire focus was on avoiding a war or a conflict over minor issues. Even if it's a border issue, the idea was to ensure that we treat each other as equal partners, promise mutual benefit for both the countries, and respect each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. This was a very big commitment and a positive step in the relationship. Both countries promised not to interfere in each other's internal affairs as well, meaning India would not raise questions over China's sovereignty over Tibet and other disputed areas. And similarly, China was not supposed to create problems for India, be it in Kashmir, be it in the Northeast. So based on these commitments, India and China were supposed to begin a new era in the relationship by setting aside the previous friction and tensions that had already emerged. But China being this aggressive expansionist power, would not lie down even after signing the Panchsheel agreement. China would provoke India and it would escalate the Aksai-Chin border issue, creating a major security threat for India. China would continue with the road construction over here. Even today, it's a major highway. For China, this was strategically important. This road was strategically vital to link the Xinjiang province and Tibet. Because both these regions, they were the problematic regions for China. In Xinjiang, the Uyghur Muslims were rebelling. The Uyghurs had rebelled against the Chinese annexation, and the Uyghurs were resisting the Chinese control of the region. Similarly, in Tibet, the Buddhists had rebelled against the annexation that happened in 1950. So in early 1950s, China was facing multiple security problems in Xinjiang and Tibet. So it was a necessity for China to establish connectivity so that it can quickly move the troops from Xinjiang to Tibet and vice versa if required, thereby securing these regions which it had newly acquired. So China went ahead with the road construction, which clearly was taking place in Indian territory, that is in Aksai-Chin. As per the British era boundaries, Aksai-Chin should belong to India. And India's claim is absolutely right in this regard. So India objected to the road construction. We published our own maps showing Aksai-Chin as Indian territory, as part of Ladakh and the then princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. Of course, by then J&K had fully integrated as well, right? J&K had been given a special status, and Jammu and Kashmir, which included the Ladakh region, as part of J&K and the Ladakh region, Aksai-Chin was shown by India as an integral part of Indian territory. So China would raise objections to this. This even led to military mobilization by both the sides, and it even led to border clashes in the 1950s. Between Indian Army and the Chinese PLA, border clashes were reported in the Aksai-Chin region, which is in the eastern sector of the border. Parallelly, we noticed that China started creating trouble for India in the middle sector as well, near Sikkim, particularly near the Nathula Pass over here, and also towards Arunachal Pradesh, the McMahon line. China rejected the validity of the McMahon line, which had been drawn during the British era. At the Shimla Convention in 1912, that's when the then British Indian government had signed this agreement with the Kingdom of Tibet, demarcating the boundaries between British India and Tibet. So this became the McMahon line drawn by the McMahon Commission. But China rejected this boundary line and started claiming the whole of Arunachal Pradesh to itself. It would label Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet, as the extension of Tibet, and it would claim sovereignty over South Tibet, and it would refuse to recognize Arunachal Pradesh as Indian territory. Back then, this region was known as NEFA, Northeast Frontier Agency. Later, it would be renamed as Arunachal Pradesh. Now, to understand why China was meddling with India, why it was claiming these territories, why it was creating trouble in Sikkim, even in Nepal and Bhutan, China would try to create problems for India. The primary reason was Mao Zedong by then had propagated the five-finger policy. According to the five-finger policy of Mao Zedong, he believed that if China had to secure its control over Tibet, he stated that Tibet is like the palm of your hand. If Tibet is like the palm of your hand, then Tibet has five fingers or five extensions. And which are these five fingers? Ladakh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Arunachal Pradesh. It is this strategy that China followed, and in many ways, it follows this even today. It explains why China meddles and interferes in these five regions in the Himalayan belt. By destabilizing the five extensions of Tibet, China has secured its hold and control over Tibet, which has been a problematic region for China. So, by the late 1950s, the tensions had started increasing between India and China. China proposed a solution as well, stating that if India gives up its claims over Aksai Chin, then China would in turn reciprocate and give up its claims over Arunachal Pradesh, as if it was a give and take offer. But clearly, the Nehru administration rejected the offer because both these territories were Indian territories. Be it Aksai Chin, be it Arunachal Pradesh, they were Indian territories. There was no question of a reciprocal exchange. If, let's say, hypothetically, China had claimed one piece of Indian territory and India also had claimed one piece of Chinese territory, and then we agreed for a reciprocal exchange, maybe that would be a fair arrangement. But here China was the aggressor, claiming Indian territories and offering an exchange for India. So India rejected this outright, and very quickly we saw the escalation of tensions between both the sides. By then, India had started receiving some assistance from the United States as well. Even though India was non-aligned, we were receiving some financial aid and food aid from the United States. Gradually, India-US were trying to build a friendly relationship, and the US was supporting India in the defense domain as well. The US would help India's intelligence bureau to set up a covert unit called Establishment 22, a highly secretive unit to conduct espionage operations in Tibet to monitor China's activities, especially China's nuclear weapons program, which had been accelerated. Because China's nuclear weapons program was seen as a threat for both India and the United States. So this was a rare collaboration between India and US during the Cold War, even though India was non-aligned. We did have an intelligence-based cooperation where our intelligence agencies were working together. The CIA was working with IB, because back then, IB was responsible both for foreign and domestic intelligence. RAW had still not been set up. So, as India got relatively closer to the United States, and as we started receiving some support from the United States, China saw this as a major threat. This was also one of the factors which contributed to the tensions. China always presumed that India being a democracy, it would automatically align with the Western democracies. But that was never the case. We understood in the previous class that India was very strongly committed to non-alignment. Especially Prime Minister Nehru had a very strong commitment to the principle of non-alignment. So this was the point. It was like an inflection point when the final trigger came in, which was the uprising in Tibet in 1959. 9 years after its annexation, the Tibetan Buddhists, they rebelled against the Chinese occupation. This massive uprising was brutally crushed by the Chinese. China would use the PLA and its troops and police forces to crush the uprising and the rebellion, causing a humanitarian situation which led to a major refugee crisis. The Dalai Lama, the religious figurehead of Tibetan Buddhists, along with lakhs of his followers, they would flee to India, seeking refuge in India. They would come down to India. You can see the newspaper clipping and the screenshot that I've added from the NCERT textbook itself as to how the Tibetan refugees came down to India seeking India's support, asking for asylum in India. So this is where India faced a very difficult choice. Because if India accepted the refugees, this would obviously instigate China. Because in the eyes of China, the Tibetan refugees were anti-nationals who were threatening China's sovereignty. So if India accommodates them, it would be a direct provocation from India. At the same time, India saw this as an opportunity. This was something which would give us leverage over China, which had been aggressive, which had triggered unnecessary border issues. So Prime Minister Nehru decided to accommodate the Tibetan refugees on humanitarian grounds, and we sheltered the Tibetan refugees. At Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh, at Kushal Nagar in Karnataka, and at few other locations, Tibetan refugee camps would be set up, and a parallel Tibetan government was also allowed to operate from India. There is a central administration of Tibet, Central Tibetan Administration, which functions even today. It acts like a parallel government of Tibet. It still fights for the liberation of Tibet, and India hosts this parallel government of Tibet in Dharamshala. The Dalai Lama, the religious figurehead, sits at Dharamshala. So when India accommodated the refugees, China saw this as a serious interference from India. China interpreted this as India's interference in Chinese internal affairs. So finally, the tensions had blown over and China started getting more aggressive against India at the disputed border. From the western sector in Ladakh all the way till the eastern sector towards Arunachal, China started mobilizing its troops as it had decided to teach India a lesson. In the eyes of China, India was like an irritant. India was a country which was creating trouble for China when that was not India's intention. Parallelly, Prime Minister Nehru has been accused of committing several blunders, strategic and tactical blunders, when it comes to the military mobilization and the military planning that was involved from 1959 to 1962. On one hand, China was escalating the border tensions and it was mobilizing more troops. And China had an advantageous position against India. It enjoyed the advantage of geography and terrain because Tibet is largely a plateau region. China had already built some essential roads and railway lines. It had built advanced military bases very close to the forward areas, and it could easily mobilize the troops along with heavy war-fighting equipment and bring them closer to the Indian border. This is where Nehru is criticized of making a strategic tactical blunder when Nehru initiated the forward policy, the controversial forward policy, and carried out a counter-mobilization even when India did not have the capabilities and resources. Nehru would go against the advice of the strategic establishment, the military advisors, political advisors, diplomats, right? The intelligence services, they would all warn Nehru to not escalate further and find a negotiated solution. But Nehru would reject the advice of all the others, and he would be guided by the then defense minister, V.K. Menon, who was also accused of playing a controversial role, and would initiate the forward policy at a time when India did not have the right resources and capabilities. The Indian army simply did not have high altitude warfare capabilities. We did not have the ability to mobilize, let's say, battle tanks or aircraft to the front lines. And according to various books and reports that have come out on the 1962 war, India was outnumbered by China with a ratio of 1:3. For every one Indian soldier that we could mobilize to the front lines, China had brought in 3. This was the number, the ratio that we were looking at. It was a 1:3 ratio. Clearly, Indian troops were outnumbered. The Chinese troops were better equipped, more capable, and they enjoyed the advantage of geography and terrain. By ignoring all the ground realities, Nehru would go for the forward policy, which becomes the biggest criticism against Prime Minister Nehru. Because this was a time for a negotiated settlement, at least to find a solution through diplomacy, through the diplomatic route. But instead, the forward policy would further instigate the Chinese. China saw this as a threat. China saw that India was preparing for a war, and it decided to punish India and declared the war against India. the PLA would invade India, and at several locations, the PLA would cross over into Indian territory, and they even held Indian territory in several parts. In Arunachal Pradesh, closer to Assam as well, right? There were places where the PLA came quite close to Siliguri corridor as well. And in Ladakh, Aksai Chin would be completely brought under the Chinese control. So since then, China gained complete control of Aksai Chin, and it is this region that we are claiming from 1962. So China would shift the boundaries itself. So we have a temporary de facto boundary in the Ladakh sector, which is the line of actual control, right? So the LAC is vastly different from the initial claim lines that India had believed in. If you look at the British era boundaries, which India had earlier adopted, the whole of Aksai Chin should have been Indian territory. And even now we insist that Aksai Chin belongs to India, and that is the rightful claim of India. But China would capture Aksai Chin, deliver a crushing defeat for India, and this came as a psychological blow for India, for the government, for the armed forces, and in general, the psyche of the Indian people was affected, right? China would become this extreme adversary, right? It would become a superior power in the eyes of Indians, and it would push India to become defensive against China for several decades. So this was a big price that India had to pay, and eventually China itself called for a ceasefire and unilaterally withdrew its troops. After achieving its objectives, see, China's objective was very simple. One was to capture Aksai Chin, which was strategically vital to link Xinjiang with Tibet, and second, to teach India a lesson, right? China achieved both the objectives, delivered the crushing defeat to India, and later it withdrew the troops and called for a ceasefire. But when the war ended, it was a massive defeat for India. It was humiliating for India. It was a psychological blow for the Indian armed forces and the Indian government in general. And following this, we saw the emergence of a nexus as well between China and Pakistan. In international relations, in geopolitics, there is this theory where you see a friend's friend, right, or enemy's enemy as a friend. This is also based on Kautilya's teachings. Chanakya, in his Arthashastra, he talks about the Mandala theory that applies for geopolitics, where he advised the king to treat the Ari's Ari as a mitra, the enemy's enemy as a friend. That's bound to happen in geopolitics, and that's exactly what happened. By then, Pakistan had hostility with India. It had fought a war with India. We still had the Kashmir issue, which was a standing issue. So both China and Pakistan would develop a strategic nexus, and it continues to bother India in many different ways. In 1963, China-Pakistan signed a boundary agreement through which Pakistan gave away the Shaksgam Valley that you can see here in the map. Just pay attention to this map. You can see the line of control with Pakistan. You can see Pakistan occupied Kashmir. You can see Aksai Chin, which is Chinese occupied Indian territory. You can see the temporary border with China, the LAC, line of actual control. You can see the McMahon line. And this is where Shaksgam Valley is located, over here in POK. This strategic region was gifted away by Pakistan to China. Pakistan gave this away on lease, and since then China has deployed troops. It has built infrastructure as well in Shaksgam Valley. In fact, the controversial CPEC project, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, passes through Shaksgam Valley and POK. Essentially, it's passing through Indian territory. So that is why India opposes the CPEC and Belt and Road Initiative, because it's a direct challenge to our sovereignty, to our territorial claims. To ensure that our claims stand, we have to reject the project, and that's exactly what India has done. We have rejected the BRI and the CPEC projects as they breach India's territorial integrity and sovereignty. So since then, China has backed Pakistan. It has even used Pakistan as a proxy against India. It would back Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. It would support the modernization of Pakistani defense forces, right? It would even, in a way, shelter Pakistan's involvement and support Pakistan's covert involvement in sponsoring terrorism against India. China would meddle in India's northeast and support several insurgent outfits via Myanmar and East Pakistan. So multiple security and diplomatic challenges opened up for India, and these are the reasons why Prime Minister Nehru takes the blame for mishandling India's relations with China in the initial years. Initially, the relationship did start on a friendly note, on a good note. The intention on the part of Prime Minister Nehru was a good intention. The intention was to build a friendly relationship with neighbors, with like-minded countries. Because we understood China's suffering and struggle historically, just like Indians had struggled against colonial rule, against outside exploitation. But eventually, Nehru administration, particularly Prime Minister Nehru, failed to understand the inherent ideology of the Communist Party of China. Nehru failed in gauging the sentiment of China, which was always driven by a violent ideology, a radical extremist ideology. This is what pushes the PRC, the Chinese state. I'm not talking about the Chinese people. I'm talking about the Chinese state, which is governed, ruled by the Communist Party. Its ideology is inherently violent, radical. It believes in expansionism. It believes in expanding its territory. It believes in aggressively reacting against its neighbors and other powers. This is inherent to the ideology of the Communist Party, which is reflected in the behavior of the PRC. This critical reading was missed by Prime Minister Nehru, and that would push India to pay a heavy price, not just in the 62 war, but in the decades later as well. So on this note, I will bring my discussion to an end. But before we end the session, as always, we'll discuss a practice question. Let's see what kind of mains question can be asked. India-China relationship began on a positive note, but it was a relationship doomed to fail. Do you agree? Discuss. So what you can do here is that in the introduction, you can discuss how the relations developed between India-China in the early days in 1949. You can point out that when PRC was established following the Civil War, India reached out to the PRC and recognized the PRC as the legitimate government of China. We gave recognition, established relations, and even supported the PRC at United Nations as well. So relations did begin on a good note, and India did have a genuine intention to build a friendly relationship with a like-minded country. You can point out that India empathized with the struggle of the Chinese people. We could relate to that. Is that clear? Even though it was an armed, revolutionary, violent movement, which was vastly different from our peaceful freedom struggle, we could at least understand, empathize with the suffering of the masses, both in India and China. There was something that was in common. So this is what led the then Nehru government to reach out to China and establish a friendly relationship, which was a good move by India. But the later mishandling, be it the Chinese annexation of Tibet in 1950, China would cause the trigger, display its expansionist aggressive behavior, pushing India to react and express concern over the Tibet annexation. You can talk about how China would even trigger border issues with India by not recognizing the British era boundaries which India had inherited. Then you can talk about the attempt in 1954 to rectify the damage, to rectify the break in the relationship. India-China signed the Panchsheel agreement, and they tried to implement the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence so that both the Asian giants could coexist in the same space. But however, given China's aggressive behavior and its inherent tendency to incline towards violence, this would never sustain the kind of pressure that China would bring against India. It would escalate the boundary issue, and as India was perceived as closer to US, and as India got involved in the crisis in Tibet, right, especially the refugee crisis, when India accommodated the Tibetan refugees and Dalai Lama and allowed the Tibetans to form a parallel government, these were the triggers for China, and China displayed its aggression, which was expected, anticipated, against India, that led to the 1962 war. So you can say that even though the relationship began on a positive note, it was a relationship that was doomed to fail, given the fundamental differences between India and China. Be it the ideological differences, India being a peaceful democracy with China being an authoritarian communist state, or be it the differences over the boundary issue, be it the Tibetan crisis. We never saw eye to eye. We were never on the same page. So it was a relationship doomed to fail, and primarily the blame lies with China itself. And after that, the blame lies partly with the Nehru administration for some of the flawed policies. Some of them were strategically, tactically incorrect policies, which led India to pay a heavy price. So you can mention the war, the conflict, and the long-term impact of the tensions between India and China. Maybe you can plug in a current context. You can talk about the recent tensions, including the clashes that have occurred in Ladakh 4 years ago and the military standoff that continues in Ladakh even today. So that way you can connect the events of 1950s and 60s with the current developments and show how China has been aggressive against India. You can even point out the China-Pakistan nexus. Just a couple of points about the China-Pakistan nexus, how China has backed Pakistan and in a way enabled Pakistan as a proxy against India. And finally, conclude your answer. In the conclusion, don't be very pessimistic. Of course, even though there are tensions in the relationship, don't be entirely pessimistic. Always have faith in diplomacy. You can mention that even now there are opportunities for India-China to work together. You can quote former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who had stated that India-China, the world is so large enough that both India-China can be accommodated. The rise of India-China need not be a competition. It need not turn into a conflict. We can coexist in the same space. India-China both can rise and thrive in the same space, in the same region. This was a historic statement by former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. So you can quote that and you can mention that there are areas of cooperation provided if we work together. First, we have to resolve the boundary tensions. If not finding a final solution, at least we should have temporary peace and stability along the border. China, which has not followed the agreements, the boundary agreements, should uphold the commitments it has made to India. That is a suggestion you can provide. China has breached the commitments under the boundary agreements of 1993, 1996. So provided if China shows a corrective behavior, India can also reach out. India can also build better relations. Diplomacy should be given a chance, right? So try to end this on a positive note, trying to provide some hope that the relations can still be rectified by relying on diplomacy. But at the same time, India needs to be cautious. India needs to be prepared. We need to modernize our military, our armed forces, improve our border infrastructure, which we are doing, and work with like-minded powers like US, Japan, Australia, and the others. So give some examples like this and end your answer on this particular note. So this concludes my discussion for today. I hope you guys have understood whatever we discussed. Do let me know what you think in the comments. If you liked it, do press the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That is it for today. We'll see you in the next session. Take care. Have a good day. NCERT books are unavoidable to crack the IAS exam. Not only is the content of these books authentic, but these books also help a civil services aspirant to build conceptual clarity. And most importantly, lots of questions in the civil services examination are directly asked from NCERT books. But the aspirants often find it difficult to cover these books, or worse, they even end up ignoring these books. We at Unacademy IAS English are going to make the reading and understanding of the NCERT books easier. We present NCERT Fundamentals course, a free initiative of Unacademy IAS English. What are the highlights of this program? Comprehensive coverage of the most relevant NCERT books for the civil services exam. Prelims and mains practice questions in each session to test your understanding of the fundamental concepts. This course begins from 12th of July every day at 6 p.m. right here on our YouTube channel. Subscribe to the channel now.